about the things, the fashions, the things that come and go, and to understand what is the bedrock of society and what makes it tick. And
the British monarchy has always taken care in appearances, in order, togetherness, and the beautiful illusion that the royal family travels together behind the glittering gates of Buckingham Palace. However, beneath the surface, hidden behind centuries-old tapestries and stone-cold custom, far more human truths have quietly festered. And now, after decades of dedication, sacrifice, and silence, Princess Anne has spoken, and everything has changed. It began not with a scandal in the tabloids or a leak from a disgruntled aide, but with a single whispered statement at a diplomatic banquet. "This isn't what our mother wanted." Those few words, as cutting as they were subtle, cut to the core of a monarchy torn between duty and deviation. Because for Princess Anne, this was not about ego. It was not about the spotlight or power. It was about honor, and a pledge made in the waning days of her mother's reign. Queen Elizabeth II, with all her grace and tolerance, had made it clear in private that Camilla would be dubbed Queen Consort, not Queen. A carefully chosen distinction that honored tradition while providing Charles with the affection and support he desired. However, between those whispered requests and the spectacle of the crowning, the title was quietly changed. No royal decree, no public debate, simply a polished Queen Camilla appearing on official documents, websites, and signage. Anne watched it develop with the same steely glare she'd had for 70 years, but behind her was a rising tempest. And the storm eventually broke, not with a tantrum or theatrics, but with a steady, unmistakable confrontation that caught King Charles completely off guard. Because when Anne talks, the monarchy listens. And now King Charles, who was already battling to reconcile his rule with rising public criticism and evolving family relations, has been thrust back into the spotlight, not as the monarch in power, but as a son confronted with the ghost of his mother's ambitions and a sister who refuses to let those intentions go. "It's time to reveal everything," Charles allegedly told close aides days later. "The truth can't stay buried any longer." What is the truth? Why now? And what role does Camilla play in the unraveling story? This is the story of a dynasty at odds with its own history, a queen who was never supposed to exist, and a princess who refuses to be silent. And it all starts with a revelation that destroyed the palace's facade of unity and may now permanently alter the monarchy. In the latter chapter of her amazing reign, Queen Elizabeth II became more deliberate than before. She realized time was not on her side, and while her public appearances remained composed and formal, she was dealing with far more personal and painful issues. One of the most sensitive problems on her mind was the future of the monarchy under her son, Charles. She had spent a lifetime grooming him for the throne, witnessing his transition from a sensitive, sometimes misunderstood prince to a man technically capable of leading. However, there was one issue she could never truly embrace: Camilla. Though Queen Elizabeth publicly approved Camilla's appointment as Queen Consort following Charles's succession, which many regarded as a sign of reconciliation, the Queen's private stance was more nuanced. According to various palace sources who served during her final years at Balmoral, the Queen made a modest but firm request during several private family discussions. Camilla is to become Queen Consort. That title acknowledges her support without erasing the past. Leave it at that. It was not about punishment. It wasn't about holding grudges. It was about precedent and legacy. The Queen was aware that Diana's shadow remained great, and elevating Camilla beyond consort may spark reaction and destabilize the very monarchy she had spent her life defending. Only a small group of senior royals were present during such conversations. Among them was Princess Anne. The Queen's only daughter had always been her confidant, truthful, devoted, and duty-bound in ways few others could equal. Anne was not emotional about the situation. she simply nodded as if to say, "I understand. It will be finished." But after the Queen died, something changed. As Charles's coronation approached, the narrative began to change. First, it was subtle. Palace documents began to refer to Queen Camilla, and the royal family's official website amended her title. The coronation invitations featured Queen Camilla prominently, with no mention of consort. Anne noticed right away. At first, she attempted to approach it softly. Behind the scenes, she spoke with Charles. "It's not what she wanted," she reminded him. "You can still change it." But Charles, newly anointed and deeply invested in Camilla's loyalty, hesitated. He had finally established his position on the throne. Denying Camilla the full honor of the title would be a betrayal, not only of their love story, but also of the lady who had weathered decades of controversy to stand with him. So, the Queen's final wish was overruled. Quietly and without fanfare, Anne was devastated, not because Camilla was awarded a crown, but because her mother's clearly stated boundaries were disregarded by the son she had nurtured to appreciate the monarchy's rules above all else. For Anne, it wasn't just about titles. It was about the truth. This is about legacy, regarding the sacred line between personal affection and societal responsibility. Those present at Balmoral reported that after the Queen's death, Anne became more withdrawn, less patient and diplomatic. The loss alone had devastated her, but the erasure of her mother's desires pushed her over the edge. It was no longer solely about her mother's death. It was about her voice being overridden and her previous decision being undermined. And the wound never healed. Anne finally broke her silence months later at that now infamous diplomatic luncheon, and it wasn't a slip of the tongue. It was a premeditated blow. "This isn't what our mother wanted," she said, fully aware that her words would reverberate across the monarchy's power structures. She wasn't simply speaking for herself at that point. She was speaking for the Queen. Her message was clear. The truth had been concealed for too long. As the grandeur of King Charles III's coronation approached, plans were on to make history. Lavish rehearsals filled Westminster Abbey, journalistic outlets planned celebration spreads, and the country was buzzing with excitement for a monarch who had waited his entire life to wear the crown. But inside the palace walls, another story was silently unfolding, one that would shock not just the public, but even the royal family itself. It began with the invitations. They were elegant, embossed, and steeped in history, with a title that surprised some insiders. Queen Camilla, no consort, no asterisk, simply Queen. It's clear, prominent, and unmistakable. For the majority of the people, it seemed like a sensible step. Camilla had supported Charles through decades of scandal, humiliation, and personal development. Her approval ratings had gradually increased, and many saw her as a symbol of calm strength. However, many who were aware of Queen Elizabeth II's private wishes, particularly Princess Anne, saw this as a worrying departure from tradition. The action wasn't purely symbolic. It constituted a rewrite of royal precedent. For centuries, the designation Queen Consort was reserved for a reigning king's wife, recognizing her support function, but without elevating her to the status of sovereign in her own right. It was a sensitive difference, especially in a monarchy still grieving the loss of Diana. Anne had cautioned Charles that putting Camilla in the spotlight with a title that the Queen had never approved would result in scrutiny, uncertainty, and worst of all, division. But Charles had made up his mind. Whether motivated by love, guilt, or a desire to finally have Camilla totally acknowledged, he let the entire title stand. Palace aides were directed to revise all official communications. The website has been changed. The term consort was dropped entirely from press releases. By the time Coronation Day arrived, Queen Camilla was no longer controversial. It was the norm. However, within the palace, reactions were far from homogeneous. Princess Anne, ever the devoted daughter and enforcer of her mother's unwritten standards, was incensed. She made her views obvious, not with drama, but with strategic coldness. At a private reception the night before the coronation, she reportedly refused to acknowledge Camilla's title, referring to her solely as Mrs. Parker Bowles. Even Prince William and Kate, albeit more reserved, were believed to have shared Anne's apprehension, expressing subtle misgivings about the timing and optics of the title change. Behind closed doors, employees were torn. Some hailed Camilla's promotion as a sign of a more modern mixed monarchy. Others expressed concern that Elizabeth's final directive had been removed. A palace insider summed up the tension. There were 2 coronations that day, Charles and Camilla's, and only one of them received the Queen's blessing. The public may not have been aware of the whole scope of the drama, but the breach was present, expanding with each headline that hailed Queen Camilla without context. In that silent fight between honoring tradition and altering history, Anne was planning her next move. Because for her, it was more than simply titles. It was about the truth and a monarchy that couldn't afford to lie to itself. Diplomatic banquets among the royal family are typically formal gatherings, intended to demonstrate unity, poise, and the crown's gracious power. But on a frigid November evening, the facade crumbled. The event was the annual Commonwealth diplomatic reception at Buckingham Palace, a magnificent celebration that invited high commissioners, ambassadors, and international dignitaries. Cameras flashed, protocol was followed, and all eyes were on the royal family as they walked into the ballroom in formation. King Charles led the parade, with Camilla by his side, newly crowned, titled, and decked with Queen Mary's crown. Behind them went Prince William and Kate, closely followed by Princess Anne. But anyone paying attention would have noticed it. The way Anne maintained her distance. Her jaw was clenched more tightly than usual. The tension had been building for months, ever since Camilla's title was discreetly elevated against Queen Elizabeth's known intentions. Anne, who was very loyal to her late mother, had held her mouth for as long as she could. But that night, it finally slipped, or perhaps intentionally cracked. As the family made their rounds meeting visitors, a visiting Canadian ambassador went to Princess Anne and exclaimed warmly, "Isn't it wonderful to have Queen Camilla representing Britain with such grace?" Anne's response was immediate and chilly. "We already had a queen who embodied grace. The function was never intended to be inherited by someone else." The diplomat, astonished, remained silent, but the harm had been done. Those in earshot gasped, including several senior aides and international diplomats. Camilla, standing just a few steps away, turned pale. The room, once filled with polite laughing and string music, suddenly appeared frozen. Later that evening, Camilla allegedly cornered Charles in a private hallway, apparently shaken. "She's making a mockery of me in front of the world," she said sharply, her voice wavering not from fear, but from rage. Charles, caught between his sister and his wife, did not say anything. But Anne wasn't done. Anne neglected to raise her glass during the official toast, as King Charles praised Commonwealth unity when Camilla's name was mentioned. Cameras missed it, but the guests didn't. One diplomat later referred to the incident as the sharpest act of royal defiance I've ever witnessed. The next day's newspapers made no note of Anne's comments, but murmurs flooded Westminster. Senior courtiers attempted to limit the fallout. Aides encouraged Anne to provide an explanation. She refused. "I said what needed to be said," she told a source. "Our mother's words were definitive, and it has been neglected." Charles, distraught and humiliated, reportedly begged Anne to discreetly apologize to Camilla. She declined again. To Anne, this was no longer about family politics, but about a monarchy that had broken its own rules. Anne was fighting despite her stern demeanor, not with guns, but with the facts. And now that the public had caught a peek of the schism within the palace, the concept of a peaceful monarchy began to disintegrate. Because once Anne spoke, there was no going back. To understand why Princess Anne spoke out, why she put everything on the line to publicly dispute the crown's decisions, you must first comprehend her modest sacrifice. Because although her brothers wear the crown and dominate headlines, Anne has long been the monarchy's unheralded backbone. She was the second child, born into a world where monarchs were glorified and sons were crowned. But Anne did not shrink from her early days. Instead, she endured. Anne was pushed to the sidelines as Charles was groomed for the throne and given academic privileges. However, she never complained. She thrived in silence, becoming the most hard-working royal by far, often scheduling more official engagements in a year than the rest of the family combined. Where others in the firm stumbled, scandals, divorces, extravagant spending, Anne remained scandal-free, focused, and devoted. She avoided excessive luxury, declined titles for her children, and insisted on raising them in a normal environment. While previous royals relied on status, Anne established her identity through service. So, when Queen Elizabeth II began to slow down in her later years, Anne quietly stepped up, frequently serving as her mother's shadow, advisor, and emotional anchor. The Queen, in turn, confided in her deeply. Anne sat by her during important decision-making times. Anne bore the Queen's disappointment with Charles's tumultuous love life. And it was Anne who listened intently when the Queen mentioned Camilla, and her determination to maintain the title of Queen Consort as a limit. So when that barrier was crossed, and Camilla became queen rather than Queen Consort, Anne saw more than simply a twisted title. She witnessed her mother's memory being overwritten. That was unacceptable to Anne. All those years of devotion, discipline, and self-sacrifice had been based on a single belief: the monarchy must honor its history and keep its promises. When Charles rejected it, allowing love and sentiment to trump legacy, he broke more than simply tradition. He betrayed his mother. He deceived Anne. According to Anne's friends, the banquet event was not unexpected. It had been developing for some time. For months, she had been quietly stewing as courtiers hailed Camilla's grace, and the media treated her promotion as unavoidable. What made matters worse was that Anne had always accepted Camilla personally. While their connection was never particularly cordial, Anne tolerated her brother's pleasure. However, Camilla's title change, completed without consultation, against the Queen's desires, and without even an official announcement, felt like a personal slight. She did everything right, a former palace staffer said of Anne. She dedicated her life to the crown, and now, in the most vital moment, they leave her out. For Anne, silence was no longer a strength. It was complicated. After 70 years of loyalty, she snapped, not with drama or tantrums, but with carefully chosen words, public refusals, and an unwavering commitment to her mother's heritage. Because while others may sit on thrones or wear crowns, Anne bears the weight of the institution itself, and she will not let it become fiction. For King Charles III, the crown has never been easy to wear. Even in the twilight of his life, the throne carries more hardship than grandeur. Nothing has emphasized that weight more than the battle between two of his life's most powerful women, his late mother and his current wife. Queen Elizabeth II was more than just Charles's ruler. She was his standard, conscience, lifetime judge, and advisor. Their complex connection was founded on a common allegiance to the monarchy, but their perspectives diverged in one critical area: Camilla. Charles's relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles had been the most contentious story of the late Queen's reign. It shattered the public's trust, precipitated the breakdown of his marriage to Diana, and cast a long shadow over the family for generations. Rehabilitating Camilla in the eyes of the public was a Herculean task, one that Charles pursued tenaciously, privately and politically, frequently despite his mother's silent displeasure. So when Elizabeth died and left only one final instruction, that Camilla remain queen consort, Charles was at a crossroads. He might fulfill his mother's dying wish, upholding royal precedent and protecting the crown from accusations of favoritism. Or he might accomplish what his heart had always desired, elevate Camilla to the position he believed she deserved, not by blood or history, but by perseverance. He chose the latter, and in doing so, he created a schism with those closest to him, none more so than Princess Anne. For Charles, Anne's public rebellion at the feast, as well as her reluctance to acknowledge Camilla's title, was more than just embarrassing. It was a declaration of war on his authority as king. But, deeper down, it was a stinging reminder that no matter how far he advanced, he would always be shadowed by his mother's expectations. Camilla, for her part, was outraged. She'd endured years of controversy and humiliation. Now, just when she had reached the pinnacle of royal life, Anne was seeking to take it all away, in public. According to royal sources, Camilla requested that Charles defend her name and use Anne as an example, but Charles, who had always been more of a conciliator than an enforcer, hesitated. He refused to discipline his sister. He understood her pain because a part of him shared it. Privately, Charles has told advisors that he is troubled by one question: what would my mother think of this? Anne demands he answer the same question aloud, the identical question that William and Kate apparently discuss behind closed doors. And the weight is becoming unbearable, because Charles is now isolated, torn between a wife who expects him to battle for her legacy and a sister who considers herself the custodian of their mother's dying will. To the public, the image remains serene, king and queen standing side by side, smiling, waving, and reigning. The foundation behind the palace walls, however, is weakening, and Charles understands that no matter how many crowns he wears or how many titles he bestows, he cannot escape the fact that his reign began by rewriting the final chapter of his mother's story. Some spirits do not rest quietly. As the dust settles over Buckingham Palace, a more perilous storm is brewing, a quiet struggle over legacy. At its center lies King Charles III, divided between two forces that have created his personality. On one hand, Camilla, the woman he loves, who has stood by him through decades of dishonor and ridicule, is now crowned but still struggling for full legitimacy. On the other hand, Princess Anne is an unwavering emblem of royal duty, carrying the flame of their mother's unsaid values and refusing to let sentiment rewrite history. This isn't simply a family conflict. It's a philosophical debate over what the monarchy should be. Should it adapt to reflect personal relationships, defying convention to accommodate modern love and second chances? Or must it hold the line, honoring the codes and commitments that define its sanctity, even if the truths are unpleasant or painful? Charles prayed that he could thread the needle, that he could crown Camilla and keep the family intact. However, Anne's disobedience has demonstrated that pleasing both the past and the present is impossible. Younger royals are now watching. The heir apparent, Prince William, is thought to be growing increasingly dissatisfied with the course of the monarchy under his father. His loyalty is to his grandmother's legacy and to Anne, an aunt he has long admired. Kate, who is usually measured, reportedly supported Anne's modest effort, thinking that the crown should never be used for personal gain. As the royal family navigates this precarious new era, one thing is certain: the question of who defines the monarchy is no longer limited to coronations or constitutions. It's manifested in whispered chats, defiant toasts, and secret titles. And at the center of it all is Princess Anne, a woman without a crown but wielding more power than anyone thought. Because wearing the crown does not always confer true power. It comes from protecting what it is supposed to represent. Do you want to see thumbnail text and visual concepts for this title next?